Hello subscribers and watchers, welcome back again. This is me Said Alia here as Har from Computer Science for Self-Taught, and in this video I'm gonna dig further about async tasks. I mean how to maintain the rotation problem in Android. I mean whenever you use async tasks to download an image by using a background thread, I mean by using async tasks, whenever you rotate the screen, the current activity will get destroyed and it will put away and a new activity will be created, and the old async task doesn't have any idea about screen has rotated, so the async task keeps updating the progress bar of the older activity from the background, and the user won't see how much of that image has been downloaded. So in this video I'm gonna fix that. In the previous video I have told you can use some codes to do so, but in here I'm going to use Fragment to help us the rotation problem. So the first thing that I want to tell you guys, I've created an edit text and there are some attributes of edit text, and this is the buttons which I've created here, and I have to handle its method on click method, and I also create a relative layout and also I give it an ID. I use this relative layout to show us the percentage of the image that has been downloaded by the async task from the background thread, and I've also created a text view which tells us the image is downloading, and also a progress bar to show us how much of that image is downloaded. And I put these two widgets inside the relative layout. By the instance of relative layout I will access to these text views and progress bar, and I also created a list view which is in here and also with its attributes, and I set the entry to some values or some items that I have written inside the string variable. So these are the links of those images which I want to download them by using async tasks, and this is the entry that I have given to the main activity. If you're confused about this one and this one, don't worry, it is just a label for this. Whenever you see the tree and item 1, for example the tree and nature, that represents this first line of code, and if you see true lovers and the tree, this label represents the second item, and so on and so forth. So these are the link of those images that are gonna download by using async tasks. So this is the image that I want to get its address. The first thing you need to do is shoot the image and then copy this link. Okay, this is the link of this image. If you're not sure, make sure that you write it in another tab and click enter. Okay, this is the image that I have downloaded. So I'm going to create a label for this item superheroes, I mean the 7th superhero, and I paste the link in here. And also I've already set their adapters also, and also I have linked these buttons, edit URL, relative layout, and all these things. Okay, and I've already handled the on click listener, which is nothing that this listener I have given it the exact link the user click on the list view from the internet. Okay, if you're not confused, make sure that you pause the video and write this code. I do not want to make this video much longer. I just want to give you the exact work of async tasks and how to fix the rotation problem. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a fragment. If you have jumped suddenly to this video, make sure that you watch our previous video that I have given you a lot of definitions and examples of fragments, and in here I just give you a little info. A fragment is nothing but it is just a piece of an activity. You can put many fragments inside one activity. Okay, so let's create a fragment and create a Java class and name this my fragment, and its super class should be fragment class, and make sure that you import it from the support v4.app library, because if you import from this library you provide backward compatibility with the older or with the previous versions of Android, but if you use this library you do not provide backward compatibility with the previous versions of Android. If you use this library and if some users open your app with their previous versions of Android, your application may crash. So the best way that you need to implement the fragment from the v4 support library. Okay, I'm going to click this one and click OK. So there are some life cycles of fragments that you really need to understand that, and I've also given you extra information about fragments life cycle on the previous tutorials. Make sure that you check them out in my playlist. The first method that fragment has is on attach. Okay. This is the first time when the fragment attaches to the activity. So I'm gonna pause the video and I write those steps in here. Okay, and make sure that you write them properly. So these are the life cycles of fragments. The first one is on attach, when fragment attaches itself to the activity, and this is the on create where the fragment gets created and where the view of that fragment gets created, and this is the step where your fragment is created properly and it's showing to the user, and this is the on resume, on pause, on stop, on destroy, on destroy view, on destroy, on detach. These are the steps that get called sequentially one after another. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create an instance of my fragment inside main activity. So to do that, I'm going to create my fragment outside of onCreate. I mean, I'm gonna make it private, my fragment, and I'm going to initialize that fragment inside my onCreate method. My fragment equals to new my fragment. So to work with fragments, you need some classes that you really need to use them, and those are transactions and fragment manager. So to add this fragment to the activity, you need to call the get support fragment manager and call the begin transaction, and it returns fragments begin transaction, and call the add method, and in here it requires a fragment, so I pass my fragment object, and the second is a tag. This is the tag where we are gonna refer to it later, okay, and I call it my fragment 1, and also call the commit method, otherwise your fragment won't work. So we want to attach this fragment to the activity only when this activity is created for the first time. So how we can do that? We can check that by the instance that is returned to the bundle variable. If the save instance is null, it means the activity is created for the first time, and if the save instance state was not null, it means it is the second time that this activity gets created. So we can put these lines of codes inside an if else statement. So I say if the save instance state is equals to null, so only create this fragment for the first time, otherwise we will get this fragment if this activity is created for the second time. So how we can do that? We write the fragment object in here, and I call the get support fragment manager, and I call find fragment by tag, because we have given this fragment a tag. We don't want to create another fragment when we rotate the screen. When we rotate the screen, I almost forgot that this activity will be destroyed and another activity will get created. When you're in portrait mode, so the saved instance is null for the first time, so it's going to create our fragment and attaches itself to our main activity, and whenever you rotate the screen, the fragment gets destroyed and a new activity will get created, and in this time the save instance state is not null because it keeps the state of the previous activity. So if the saved instance is not null, we don't want to create another fragment again. So what we're gonna do, we are gonna use the previous instance of that fragment by calling get support fragment manager and call find fragment by tag, and I write the tag in here. This is why I've told you we must use the fragment tag so that we can refer to them later. I'm going to copy and paste this because I have a temptation that it may not work. So the reason it gets us error because we need to cast this to the my fragment class because it returns an instance of fragments, so we need to cast this to my fragment. So this is where the problem is solved. I'm going to show these steps, how they are created and how they are called one after another in the debug mode. So for that, I'm going to create an instance in here, and I make it private, and I call log t, and I'm going to use this tag, and I show them in the debug mode how these methods get called one after another. So I say log I, the tag automatically attaches itself in here. This is the tag, which is this one. By using this tag, we are going to shoot these methods in the debug mode. So again, I'm gonna call log I, so I automatically call onCreate, and if I put log I, so I'm going to put this before the return statement here, and also log I. So I'm going to pause the video. I don't want to make this video much longer. So now I have done everything. Whenever on attach gets called, this will be printed on the debug mode, and it says on attach gets called, on create gets called, on create view gets called, and on start gets called, and on pause, and so on and so forth. Listen and see what happens. And also, I almost forgot that whenever the current activity gets destroyed, the fragment also gets destroyed along with the activity. We don't want fragment get destroyed when the activity gets destroyed. So how we can do that? So first let's run and see it with your own eyes. So this is it. Whenever I click on the true lovers or superheroes, this is the link of that amazing image, which is going to be downloaded by the async task from the background. So whenever I click on the download image, so it's going to be displayed, or it's going to be downloaded. But now we must see how the activity gets created. So in here it requires I choose it into info. We need to pass that fragment tag, which I've created here, my fragment. Let's paste this in here, Ctrl C, Ctrl V. So now it's going to filter it. So I'm going to choose my emulator. Now you see on attach, on create, on create video, on activity created, on start, on resume gets called when the activity gets created. Whenever we rotate the screen, the current activity will get destroyed. Along with this activity, the fragment also destroyed. But we don't want the fragment gets destroyed when we rotate the screen. Okay? What we want in here is whenever we rotate the screen, the activity gets destroyed, but we don't want the fragment gets destroyed. So if I rotate the screen, let's see what happens. You see that after the on resume, on pause, on stop, on destroy view, on destroy, and on detach gets called, and again on attach, on create, on view gets called. It means that whenever you rotate the screen, the activity gets destroyed. Along the activity, the fragment also gets destroyed. But we don't want to do this. So how we can do that? So inside the fragment class and the on activity created, I'm gonna call another method set written instance and I put the true variable in here. It means that whenever the screen rotates, do not remove or do not destroy fragment. Okay? This line of code means save the state of the current fragment and do not destroy this one. If you observe the debug mode in here, whenever we rotate the screen, the first time on attach, this step gets called, and when we rotate, the on stop, on destroy, on stop, on destroy view, on destroy, on detach gets called. But this time, only the on create and on destroy don't get called. You can see that the second time, again, the on create gets called, and when we rotate the screen again, the on create gets called again. You see that on create, on destroy gets called again. So now if we run this, only the on destroy and on create won't get called. Okay, let's run and see this. I'm going to delete the logcat and let's pop up the emulator in here. As you can see, the on create won't get called this time when we rotate the screen. Okay, let's see. On pause, on stop, on destroy. You can see the on destroy didn't get called, and also the on create didn't get called in here because we set the Android, set the state of the current fragment and don't destroy it. There is one thing that you really need to see, that you can see when the activity rotates, on attach gets called, and also you can see that the on detach gets called. This is the places that we are gonna tell the async task the previous activity has destroyed and you need to get a new instance of the newly created activity. So by using these two methods, we are gonna tell the async task, oh async task, the previous activity has been deleted, you need to get the new instance. So how we can tell the async task to get a new instance? So inside the on attach, as you can see, when the first time the fragment gets created, it's going to attach itself to the activity, so it's also get an instance of that activity. So in here we are going to create another variable to store the instance of that activity. So I'm going to call context and context in here, and I'm going to initialize that context into the context that async task returns from us. So in here we are gonna set the context to the async task class. So let's create the async task class, Java class, and I call my async task class. So I'm going to extend this from the async task and click OK. So as you can see, async task is a generic class, so it requires some parameter. The first parameter is the input. So we are gonna give a URL as input, I mean the link of those images to the do in background method to download the image from us. And while the image is downloading, so we need to get the percentage of how much of that image is downloaded. So we are going to get that in the form of integer. And also we don't want to get any output, okay? So we need to implement the do in background method. There are several methods that you also need to import that, and they are on pre-execute, on do in background, on progress update, and on post execute. And you also need to implement that on cancel method if the user cancel download. So we have to pop up a message to the user that the current or the download has been cancelled. So in here we are going to create another method to my async task so that it can hold the current instance of that activity. So I'm going to create a private variable in here, and I'm going to name it context. Also need to create onAttach method in here, so you can put any name if you want. Sorry about this, like say public void onAttach, so it's going to get a context. So I'm going to initialize the current context to the context which the onAttach returns to us. So this is how we can get the context, or the reference to that activity. So inside the fragment, we must first check that if the async task is running or initialized or not. So we are going to create an instance of my async task class in here. My async task class, my async. Okay, and in here we are gonna say if my async is not null, then only call that method. And we pass the current context in here, which is initialized by onAttach. This is how we set the context to the current activity by this method, and we need to create constructor of my async task class, because whenever we initialize an instance of my async task, we need to pass a context also. And we only call the onAttach and we pass the context. This is how we will work. So let's jump to the my fragment, and in fragment we need to create a method so that we can call that method to start the download. So we call this method start or public void begin downloading image. Okay, and in here I'm going to create that instance of async task. So I'm gonna initialize my async task equals to new my async task class. So it requires a context, so we pass the current context. This is the context that we have initialized by onAttach, and we say my async dot execute. So it requires a URL, because I have told the async task that you will get a URL input, so we need to pass a URL. So we are going to a URL from here. We are going to get this the URL in the form of a string, link of image, and we are going to cast that link. To cast the string into URL. So the URL class doesn't have any parse method. We need to create an object of URL inside the execute method URL. So we pass the link of image. So it may throw an exception. So we need to cast this. We need to surround it with try and catch. So this is how we pass the URL input to the doing background. You can see that this is the input which we have right in here. This is the input which the async task will get from here, okay, and pass that link to the doing background to start the download. So one thing that is remain whenever the screen rotates, so we need to tell the async task you need to get another, you need to deinitialize, you need to make it the instance of the context as null. So we need to call another method as on public void on detach, and we set the context to null. Okay, so by using the because by using the onAttach, we will pass the newly created instance of that activity to the async task, because whenever you rotate the screen, the current activity will get destroyed, and the async task doesn't have any idea that activity is destroyed or not. And you also need to remember that the activity gets destroyed, the async task won't get destroyed, and it's going to download its image until it finishes, and it's going to update the previous instance of that activity. The user won't see the progress of that image into the newly created activity. So this is we will set the context of the newly created activity to the async task and pass this to the async task, so the async task have info about the newly created activity. So inside the onDetach of fragment, we are gonna call the onDetach method of my async task, and also you need to make sure that if my task is not null, okay, if my task is not null, then only call the onDetach method, so to make the instance of that activity to null. So this is it. So I'm going to create an instance of fragment inside the main activity. So whenever the user clicks the button of download image, so that image should be downloaded. Fragment acts as a mediator between the activity and the async task, because the fragment is gonna tell the async task a new instance activity gets created, so you need to start working with that. So inside the onCreate, we have already initialized the fragment, and in here I've told only create the instance of fragment when the activity is created for the first time, Otherwise, if the activity is created for the second time, you need to get that previous fragment by calling the tag that we have set in here. So we need to handle the onClick method. This is the method where we will start our work. So we also make sure that if the URL is not, if the edit text is not null, we have to get the text the toString if it is not null, and also if the edit URL get text dot length is greater than 0. I mean, it must be something. Otherwise, we will toss a message to the user link of images or whatever you write. And in here, we are going to start our work. And we also make sure that the fragment must not be null, okay? If my fragment is not null, then start the work. So I say my fragment dot begin download image. So it requires the link of that image. So we are going to get that from the edit URL dot get text.toString. So it's going to be passed to the begin download image in here, and we will pass this link of that image to the URL. So it's going to cast this to the URL because we have said that we will get URL as input. So now inside the on pre-execute method, as I've told you, this will be run on main thread. You want to do something before the image gets downloaded by the doInBackground method, and in here we will show the download image to the user. So now we have the context of the activity, so we are going to call a method inside the main activity to visible the progress bar to the user. So in here I'm going to cast this context, which is of type main activity, and I call show progress bar before downloading. So this method doesn't exist inside main activity, so we are gonna create this. This is the method which is created in here. So in here I say if my fragment is not null and is not null, then here we are gonna call the relative layout, and I call the set visibility to visible. If you see in the attributes, by default it is not shown on the activity. When the user clicks on the download button, so it's going to be shown to the user so that user can see the percentage of that image which have been downloaded by the doInBackground. This is the method that we have called that. Whenever the doInBackground downloads the image, so it's going to return you the percentage of how much of that image is downloaded. So we need to store them inside another variable. So I'm going to create this inside my async task, and I call this private integer image length. And we also need to create another variable as downloaded size. So we will initialize them inside the on pre-execute because it is the only method that's going to initialize them before the doInBackground starts its work. We also initialize them to 0. So in here, when the image gets downloading, so the doInBackground pass the percentage of how much of that image is downloaded. So we need to store that inside the end variable. But before doing that, we must make sure that the context is not null, because there may be a gap between the creating the activity, because whenever the doInBackground update, there may be a gap that that activity is destroyed. So we don't want to do that. So we must check that if the context is not null, update the progress bar. Otherwise, in here, toss a message to the user. So in here, I'm going to get that context which I have created in their context. So we need to cast this to the main activity, because it is an instance of main activity that we will get. And I call another method update bar, so we will pass an int value. So in here we are going to calculate that how much of the image has been downloaded. So we will create a variable as the name of data, and we will assign some percentage. So in here we need to divide the downloaded size to the image length and then multiply it to the 100. Multiply it to 100 because we have set the max size of our progress bar to 100. If you make it 50, so the max size of progress bar at 50, you need to multiply it by 50. As of now, we will multiply it by 100. So first we need to put that inside brackets. So in here I have to make one of them as double, because otherwise it's going to return as zeros. So I don't want to do that. So the values which is passed is in the integer values. So I'm going to say that values from index 0, which is in the form of integer, and I cast it to double divided by the downloaded size, and multiply them. Let me put them inside another bracket. Multiply them by 100. So it returns double, so we need to cast this to integer. and then we set that data into the update progress bar method of main activity. So we need to create this method inside the main activity. So from here we are gonna call the relative layout dot find view by id or dot id dot show progress bar dot set progress. So we need to cast this to the progress bar, so I'm going to put some extra brackets here, and we need to cast this to the progress bar, and then I call the set progress method, and I put this data which is returned from progress update of my async task, and I provide it into the set progress of progress bar. This is it. The error is resolved, and whenever the user whenever the image has downloaded, the on post execute gets called. So in here we need to disappear the progress bar from the main activity. So again we need to cast the context, and I call another method progress bar after downloading. Okay, so we need to create this method inside main activity called the relative layout dot set visibility, and I set the visibility to gone. There may be a chance that the user cancel the download. We also need to remove the progress bar from the activity. So again we need to call another method from the main activity, and I pass the context here, and I say download cancel. So we need to create this main activity inside. We need to create this method inside the main activity, and then in here I say I toss a message to the user. So we also need to remove the we need to set the visibility to gone, and also toss the message to the user downloading is cancelled. Okay, if the image has downloaded, we also tell the user that the image has downloaded successfully. This is done with the main activity. So let's start our work inside the do in background. So I'm going to end this video in here, and I do not want to make this much longer. If you do not understand anything, make sure that you rewatch this video till you understand the concept. So again, if I make it brief, whenever the activity rotates, the activity gets destroyed, and the async task which starts downloading the image with the instance of that activity doesn't have any idea if the activity gets destroyed. So we use the fragment that tells the Android that the previous activity has destroyed. You need to get this instance of newly created activity and start working with this. By using the async task, we will be updating the progress bar from the on progress update, so it is the fragment doesn't get destroyed. So this brings us to the end of this particular tutorial, and if you guys like this video, make sure that you subscribe us, and also please support my efforts on my channel by watching my videos through YouTube. So make sure that you watch second step of this remain video in the next video, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Have fun learning. Peace out.